everyone! Tonight I am going to be talking about how you can do a crocheted chevron stitch to create this really quintessential stitch that's often used for blankets with stripes of different colors. It's a really fun technique to do. We're going to talk about it. Tonight I'm going to be talking about how to create the chevron stitch in crochet, well known from things like 80s blankets that you lay on the back of your couch. I actually think this is a really fun stitch. I have done a scarf with it where I did the scarf lengthwise. So the chevrons, I did it in a multicolored variegated yarn, so the stripes kind of changed colors as they went along, and the chevron going a long ways down the full length of the scarf. I thought it just gave it an extra little bit of interest, which I really liked. But this is a great fun stitch and fabric to create, and it is not hard. You're basically just doing double crochets, but it's a little bit more interesting than making something that's just double crocheted. So if you want just a kind of a mindless project to work on while you're doing something else, but you don't want to have to put a lot of brain cells in there, this would be a great way to get started. So let's jump on in. I'm actually going to jump in with the piece that I've already made to talk through the basics of what we're doing, and then I'll go back and say how you would start the whole project. You start it exactly the same way you do the middle of it, but I know it can feel a little bit intimidating when somebody starts with something already started to say this is how you start from the beginning. So the basic concept of a chevron is you have these diagonals that go up and then down and then up and then down. So there's the hill and there's the valley. And as you add more rows, these hills and valleys get even more pronounced on there. But the basic concept is the straight edges. So the straight edge that goes up to the hill and the straight edge that comes back down to the valley. You're going to have the same number of double crochets in each of those spots. So for this particular one, I have 5. So I have 5 double crochets that go up, and then you put 3 double crochets into the exact same hole. Get a little bit closer so you can see. Into this one hole, there's 3 double crochets that all go into that exact same spot. And smushing lots of stitches together into one hole, you got, instead of just one, that would make this a flat line. If you put 3 things all in there, you've created a bunch more fabric than was there as part of your straight line. That fabric has to go somewhere, just physics. It exists, so it's got to go somewhere. And what happens is that smooshing a bunch of extra fabric in a spot where there's no room for it, it makes that flare out. It pushes it up and out. And that is what's going to create your hill. So you do whatever number, so 5 in this particular case, but you could do 7 or 10 or 25, whatever number you want to do. 5 across, you do 3 into the same hole for the peak, the hill of your chevron. Then you do 5 down the side, and then you skip 2. The skip 2 is more obvious because you've got this hole that it creates. So you skip 2. And skipping 2 in crochet is incredibly easy. You truly just don't put your hook in those 2 and go move on to the next one. So then you do 5 back up. And if you're doing a longer piece, so you're doing a blanket or you're doing a scarf lengthwise or something, you would do 5 back up, 3 into the same hole, 5 back down, skip 2, 5 back up, 3 into the same hole, 5 back down, skip 2. You're just doing that. That is it. That's all you do every row until you either run out of yarn or get bored enough that you call your project done. So the basics of how to achieve the chevron fabric is really straightforward. There are a lot of things that you can play with to kind of make it your own if that is what you would like to do. So I'm going to go over, there is kind of one trick with the chevron, and that is how to keep your edges square. So what it's very easy to do with the chevron stitch is instead of, you can see how I've got, if I keep going and making this, so let's say I'm going to do this as a narrow scarf, and I'm going to make this 6 feet long. What what can happen if you're not following a specific pattern, or sometimes even if you are, if you just haven't quite gotten it figured out exactly right, you can end up getting it very, very quickly. One edge of it will get longer. So instead of there being five that go up on the first row, you'll end up with 6, and then the next time there'll be 7, and then the next time there'll be 8, and then the next time there'll be 9. And so instead of it being straight edges that just go straight up for your blanket or whatever it is that you're making, you end up with a triangle. And that's generally, if that's not the shape you were going for, that's not what you want. So you are going to need to do this one little trick. So I want to go over that, how we do that trick. So there are sort of 2 issues that you need to deal with. So on the side, so if you're ending, you've done a hill and you're ending at the base of a hill, your edge, just this section at the edge. So the middle is exactly the way I described it. Absolutely nothing changes. There's no complicated parts at all. It's just this little part from either the peak, if that's what's right before the edge, or the valley, if that's what's right before the edge, where if you don't do something for these stitches, just these 5 stitches, you're going to end up with, if the peak is the closest thing to the edge, you're going to end up adding more and more and more stitches every time. If the valley is where you end up with, you're going to end up making this shorter and shorter and shorter. So it's going to come, instead of this being straight up and down this way, you're going to lose stitches on this edge and gain stitches on this edge. So your piece is going to go that way. Which may be kind of a cool thing to play with, but if that wasn't what you were aiming for, you're going to feel like you did it wrong. So let's talk about it. When you are on the edge where the closest thing that happens to the edge is that you are skipping stitches, because you're skipping stitches, if we think through this, when we're at the peak of our hill, we add 2 stitches. So we do 3 stitches into the same hole. Normally, you would do 1 stitch into the same hole. So the difference between the 1 stitch that you would normally do and the 3 stitches that you actually do is 2 stitches. You've put 2 stitches in there that wouldn't normally be there. Can you tell I have tiny children, and so there's a lot of adding with the fingers. I'll pretend like I don't just add with my fingers on my own. So we've got 2 extra stitches that come right here from that hill that we created to get that effect of the bump that we wanted. And then when we skip stitches at the bottom, skipping stitches pulls our fabric in to make that little like V shape to give that effect that we wanted. Because we skip 2 stitches down here, we got 2 extra up here. We subtracted 2 stitches down here. Everything works out perfectly. We add 2, we take 2 away. We add 2, we take 2 away. Well, on the edges, on the edge where you took 2 away, we're not doing an add to section because this is the edge. So we've got to add one, kind of one of those 2. We'll get, if you kind of think about the section where we skip 2, sort of one of those we get from the hill on this side of it, and one of those we get from the hill on the other side of it. So one of those stitches is part of this hill, but the other stitch, we don't get that stitch back because there's no hill, because we're at the edge. So we need to put it back, and putting it back is very, very easy. We just put 2 stitches into the same spot to add that 1 stitch back again. And that's going to keep 5 stitches, skip 2, 5 stitches, 3 into the same one. So I will do that closer to the camera so that you can really see exactly what that looks like. If you have done any crocheting at all, we are doing a double crochet. So we're going to do a turning chain of 3. We start by chaining 3. And then normally you always skip the turning chain. So we're not going to put our hook back through the turning chain we just did. Normally you would also skip this very first stitch right here. You would skip that and put your hook in here. If you were, so you would skip this one, you would put your hook into the very next one. So you skip the 3. Normally you would skip the 4th stitch and put your hook into the 5th stitch. But remember, we wanted to add a stitch here. So I'm actually going to crochet right into that one. So I'm going to do a crochet stitch right into there. So now it looks like I've got 2 stitches. I'm going to count those as 2. We've got our chain 3, kind of looks like a stitch, and the double crochet that I just did, which definitely looks like a stitch. So we've got 2 of our 5 done. We are going to do the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and now it's time to skip 2. And you always know that you're doing it right and you're in the right spot if you've got your 5, the ones that you're supposed to have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can kind of see from the last row exactly where, so here's our hole. We want to skip 1 on one side of the hole and 1 on the other side of the hole. We basically want to make sure our new hole for this row sits immediately on top of the hole that came before. If you're ever doing the chevron and you're skipping stitches like right here, you're just nowhere near the hole, something's gone wrong. Definitely you need to count or go back and see. It is not supposed to be there. The holes from the skipped stitches are supposed to sit right on top of each other. So we did our 5, we skipped 2. Those are exactly where they're supposed to be. To skip a stitch in crochet, truly just don't put your hook there. So don't put your hook in this stitch or in that stitch. We're putting our hook into the next one after the 2 that we skipped. And we're going to do 5 crochet stitches coming up the hill. And I'm saying 5 just because that's the random number that I picked to do this little sample. You can choose any number when you are doing yours. If you choose number that, I probably wouldn't go way smaller than 5, but the smaller the number, the closer together your zigzags are going to be, like the smaller your chevrons are going to be. If you pick a number bigger than 5, the farther apart your chevrons are going to be. So I've done 5 going up the hill, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now when I go to put 3 into the same one, you want to make sure, I'll try to get it real close here. So you can see the 3 stitches that I did next to each, or 3 all into the same hole. You can see the hole at the bottom and you can see 3 stitches go right into that hole. When we do our 3 stitches into the next hole, you want it to be the hole associated with that 3rd, or the middle one. So here's my 3. When I go to do 3 again, I want them to be right on, like centered, right in that middle spot. And so I'm going to do 3 into the same spot, 3 into the same hole right there. 1. And then to put stitches into the exact same spot, I'm going to take my hook, I'm going to poke it right through the exact hole that I just went through. And that's a 2nd stitch into the exact same spot. And I'm going to put my hook right into that exact same hole where I just went. And that is 3 into the same place. And now I'm going to do 5 double crochets going back down the hill. And that's a little bit untrue because this is an edge. If you remember, on this edge, because we had skipped 2 stitches but only added 1 stitch back because we don't have a hill on the other side, when your end falls on the side where you finished a hill, you've added 2 stitches, but only one of those stitches got skipped from over here. So since we don't have a valley that's going to skip 2 stitches over here to take up that, we need to skip 1 stitch just as we're working on our own. So I choose to do that between my 4th stitch and my 5th stitch. So I do 4 stitches just like normal. So 4 double crochets going down the hill. And then I choose to skip 1 stitch and do my 5th stitch over here. So I do 4 just normally, and then I skip 1. That creates that, it's it's a small version of the holes for the center of the chevrons along the edge. And that is going to make sure that we have 5 stitches on this edge, just like we needed to make sure we had 5 on this one and we didn't just keep losing stitches every round or every row. For this one, we need to do the same thing on the other side just to make sure that we don't keep adding stitches so that we end up with 100 stitches on this side instead of just 5. So that is the basics of how you do a chevron. To get started, so I joined on and I already had this piece going. To get started, you truly just start that process. So if you want 5 stitches here, so when I just created my chain to get started, what I thought in my head is I want 5 between each one, and I want at least 4 because I want to be able to show all of the different things. So I said I want to chain 5 and then 10 and then 15. And then I put a couple extra chains on there just to make sure if I counted wrong, I wasn't going to run out. And I often do that with crochets, do some extra chains. I'll show you how we can take those out in just a second. So I just said, okay, I want 5, 10, 15. I chained 15. I chained a couple extra just in case something went a little bit wrong. I had some extra to get working on. And then I did my very first row into this chain exactly how I did this one. I did a double crochet, or I did 5 double crochets to start with. I skipped 2, 5 double crochets, did 3 into the same one. You start that right away, just on your very first chain. And then every row it gets a little bit easier. So that very first row, I would probably go back and count and make sure you really do have 5 in all of the spots. From then on out, I don't really count all that much. I am just looking to make sure that I put my holes line up on top of my holes, and my 3 into the same spot sit right in the middle of my 3 into the same spot from the row below. And once you really get going with it, the shape becomes very obvious, the shape that you are creating. And so I think it gets easier to do that. You may still want to count every once in a while, but I personally, I don't count every row anymore after I get that, after I get those first couple of rows set up. And you can tell I did a little interesting, I call them design features. I made a mistake. And I fixed it by putting 2 stitches into the same spot, which created a little hole. It's a design feature. So that's a chevron. The couple of tips and tricks that I would recommend with chevrons, I've talked about a few of them. One of them is the do a couple extra. This is especially true if you're doing a long chain. So let's say you're doing a blanket, a very long chain, or you're doing a scarf long ways. You're going to be chaining 300 stitches, 200 stitches, a lot of stitches. I would count as you're going. I would put stitch markers in every 20 stitches or 50 stitches or what makes sense for you. And then I would do a few extra at the end, because there is nothing worse than if you need 300 stitches. You've done all the chains, that takes you a long time. You've done the pattern on all 300 stitches coming back, and you are 1 short. You did 299 stitches instead of 300 stitches, and you have to rip the whole thing out and start all over again. So do a few extra if you've got a really, really long chain. And then it's really easy. So if you do a few extra, you'll end up with this little like nubby hanging off at the end. These are unused chains. Now, depending on what you're doing, if you're going to make fringe or whatever, you may be able to hide this, but it's really easy to take this out. So you're just going to grab a hold of that slip knot right at the end. It's almost looks like an overhead knot kind of a thing, an overhand knot. You're just going to kind of pull and tug at strings until something starts unraveling. Now, when you're unlacing the chain, this is not. So if you've ever unraveled a crochet chain before, when you pull, it just goes brrrr, and the whole thing unravels. That's when you're unraveling from the other end, the end that you finished with. This is the end that we started with, so it's not going to do that. You're going to have to actually pick out each stitch. So I wouldn't do like 20 extra stitches. I would do like 3. You're just going to have to pick out, you kind of just pull and tug until a strand gets really long. And then you just pull on it. So there's not, it's not like there's a special technique to doing this. You see several strands there. I just pull until one starts making the end move, and then you know you've got the right one and you pull that one. Make sure you don't get so enthusiastic that you unlace some of the actual stitches that you used, because that would be an issue. But I pulled that down, and so now there's no little nubby left. It's just like I cast on the perfect amount, or I chained the perfect amount of stitches to start with, even though I didn't. So that's my tip if you're ever chaining a large number of stitches, and you want to make sure you're not just a few stitches too few. Or, I mean, if you didn't know that trick and you cast on a few stitches too many and you didn't like the way that little nubby worked, that could be useful as well. So a few tips that I've got specifically for working chevrons, kind of as recommendations if you do want to get started on a project like this. My first recommendation is going to be about the yarn. I would recommend stripes. I think it really shows that the zigzaggy pattern, and I think you lose some of that if it's all in the same color. So I would recommend either a self-striping yarn. So this would be a great place for Noro, or we work with an indie dyer in our local area in Indiana called BAH Yarns. BAH stands for Brenda and Heather. They do fantastic striping and gradient yarns, which I think would look really neat in a chevron. They did a special colorway just for us called Yarn Trick at the End of the Rainbow that's available on our online store, that I think would look particularly cool in a like a long chevron as a shawl or a scarf. So it's a good place for stripes. One thing to be aware of, just because I think the chevron does get used so much for blankets, you may want to look for a self-striping yarn that has long color repeats. So if you think about, I think a lot of people think of self-striping yarns as some sort of magic, that you have to have a certain set number of stitches to make the stripes work. And that's not true at all. Self-striping yarns are just going to have a very long section of one color before they move on to the next color. But if you're doing like an entire blanket length, and so let's say you've got a meter of one color. So you have that's not even enough. Let's say you have 20 feet of black and then you have 20 feet of white in your self-striping yarn. If you do a really, really narrow scarf, let's say each row only uses 1 foot of that black yarn, or of your yarn. So you do a row, it uses 1 foot. You've got 20 feet of the yarn. You use a row, it uses 1 foot. So you're going to get 20 rows because you had 20 feet of the color and each row used 1 foot. So you're going to get, of your narrow scarf, you're going to get 20 rows of that color before your yarn switches to the next color. If you're doing a blanket, so instead of casting on for a super narrow scarf, you are casting on or chaining. Sorry, I do knitting and crocheting, so casting on and chaining are the same thing, but casting on for knitting and chaining for crochet. I do know the difference. My brain mixes them up sometimes. If you were chaining for a blanket, your blanket may be 40 times as wide as your scarf. You've got a tiny little narrow scarf, you've got a king size blanket. If your blanket, one row uses more than 40 feet of yarn, which is not unheard of, a double crochet uses a fair amount of yarn in there, and you're doing a bunch of them. If your one row uses more than your 40 feet of a color, instead of one section of your chevron being black and then the next section of your chevron being white, what's going to happen is half of one row is going to be black and then half of the row is going to be white, and the colors are just going to sit weird on top of each other. This is called pooling, and it normally, I think of that happening more with variegated yarns, but it certainly can happen with self-striping yarns if you've got a really wide piece that you're working on. So if you're going to use a self-striping yarn for your chevron, I would say use one with a long color repeat. Don't get something that's more of a variegated that has kind of 5 feet of a color and then it changes to the next color. You want something with a long color repeat. I think a gradient would be really, really a fun option as well. I think the chevron would be a great way to use those mini yarn packs. We do one called palette, but there's a million billion out there where you just get a little bit of a bunch of different colors. So they'll often come in a set of 5 or a set of 10 or a set of 20. I think it would be really fun to have a background that was a solid color, and then so you'd have a black yarn that you're using. You do two rows of your chevron with the black, and then you take one of the little mini skeins, and you do 2 rows with the mini skein, and then you do 2 rows with the black, and then you do 2 rows with the next mini skein. I think that would be a neat way to do the chevrons, to actually, and then you can do that. They don't have to be mini skeins. If you have a stash of yarn, you can go through and pick out several colors that you think would work well together. If you've got just odds and ends of yarn left over, I feel like that was what the like 80s blankets were, at least the ones in my family that I remember. You've got like a red stripe, and then a blue stripe, and then an avocado stripe, and then a lemon stripe, and then a white, and then there's just all of the odds and ends of the yarns left over from a bunch of different projects. I think that can be cool as well. Another tip that would actually make the chevron stand out a little bit more, the actual look of the chevron pattern itself stand out more, that is not just changing colors, is to crochet through the back loop or through the front loop. So if you're not familiar with that idea, generally when you do a crochet stitch, you put your hook through, I call it both legs of the letter V. To me, crochet stitches have this, it looks like a letter V that runs all the way along the top, and when I put my hook through, I go underneath 2 legs of that letter V. So there's the 2 strands, and I put my hook under both of them. When you're crocheting through the back loop, you only put your crochet hook through the loop farther away from your face. If you're crocheting through the front loop, you only put your hook through the leg closer to your face. The front loop, front according to you, back according to you. And what that's going to do is, I'm not sure it's going to show up on camera super well, but I can give it a try. What that's going to do is the leg that you didn't put your hook through looks like a dash on the other side. So you're just going to see so let's see if this is going to really show up. You're just going to see that unused leg. It's going to look like a dash across, almost like somebody's taken a pencil and drawn a line, like this is where this row starts and the other row ended, of that leg that did not get used the previous time, as opposed to on the ones underneath where I didn't do that. It's just a smoother transition. So if you do that, where you're crocheting just through, now what this does do is there is one side where that leg is visible. So I was going through the front loop. So if I go through the front loop on this side, and then I flip it around, on the next side, on the back side, I'm going to go through the back loop. So you're going to go through the back loop on one and through the front loop on the other. Every time you turn, it's going to be the other way. That way that extra little dash line is going to show up a lot more visibly, and it's going to be like somebody, like I said, like texturally drew a line that goes up and down with your rows there. I personally really like the way that looks in my when I'm doing the chevron crochet stitches. The pattern that I did with this, it's a very long ago pattern, but it is still up on Ravelry. It's called Wraptile, Wraptile. I used a green variegated yarn with it, and I thought it looked like snake scales. So it's like reptile, but it's a wrap. I am a nerd, and I put entirely too much thought into the names of my patterns sometimes. We do it with yarn names too. I had you do that because I liked the way that looked, and because I wasn't changing the color stripes in mine. I really liked that added sort of definition. So that's another thing that you can kind of play with, especially if you're going to just kind of make a little sample to see if you've never done this before and you say, I want to try that. You don't even have to make a thing. You can just make a square, put it on your fridge, put it on social media, tell your friends you learned a new skill. So those would be my biggest tips. Create something that's going to really show off that really specific texture that you've created, whether that be changing colors or doing that extra trick with through the front loop, through the back loop, to give that little bit more textural interest. I also think this is a fairly subtle design, especially if you're not changing colors. So I would probably use a yarn that didn't have a lot going on. So if you've got a yarn that's variegated and fuzzy and mohair and sparkly, I think you're not going to see the hard work that you've done with this. So I would tend to go more for fairly like smooth standard yarns rather than a yarn that has a lot of bells and whistles, because I just think your pattern would get lost in there. I don't think it would look bad. I think you'd be doing a lot of extra work that you wouldn't really be able to see. So that is what I have to say about chevron crocheting. I hope it was interesting and useful. I hope it inspired somebody to pick up a crochet hook and start something tonight, just because I think the world is better when everybody creates something every day. Enjoy the rest of your evening. It is still light outside, which is fabulous. I like late night light. It means I can play in the garden after the kids have gone to bed. If you're having fun, you're doing it right, and enjoy the rest of your evening. I'll see you next time.